Both my compasses are out. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get back to Fort Lauderdale." That voice, crackling through the radio static on December 5th, 1945, belonged to Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a man with 2,500 hours of flight experience, a combat veteran of the Pacific. And at that very moment, he was utterly, inexplicably lost. What followed would become one of aviation's most haunting mysteries: 5 torpedo bombers vanishing without a trace over familiar waters, a rescue plane sent after them disappearing just as completely, 27 men swallowed by the Atlantic, leaving behind nothing, not a single piece of wreckage, not a life raft, not even an oil slick. The war had ended 4 months earlier. Japan had surrendered. The world was exhaling. And for the young aviators at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the days of flying into enemy fire were behind them. Now their missions were training flights, routine exercises designed to keep their skills sharp while the nation transitioned to peacetime. December 5th was just another day on the calendar: mild temperatures, moderate seas, a few scattered showers forecast, nothing unusual for early winter in Florida. The kind of day that invited overconfidence. If you appreciate deep dives into military history like this one, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing these untold stories to life. Now let us return to Fort Lauderdale, 1945. Flight 19 was scheduled to execute navigation problem number 1, a routine training exercise that other squadrons had completed earlier that same day. The assignment was straightforward: fly east from the Florida coast to a set of shoals called Hens and Chickens, conduct low-level bombing practice runs, then continue northeast over Grand Bahama Island before turning back toward base. The entire loop covered roughly 330 nautical miles. For experienced pilots, it should have been unremarkable. The flight consisted of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, the same rugged aircraft that had helped turn the tide in the Pacific. These planes were built by General Motors under wartime license from Grumman. Each aircraft could carry a 3-man crew, with the pilot up front, a radio man in the center, and a turret gunner in the rear. They were reliable machines, veterans of countless combat missions. That afternoon, 14 men would climb into those cockpits. Not one of them would ever be seen again. Lieutenant Charles Taylor was the flight leader. At 30 years old, he had accumulated more flying hours than most pilots could dream of. He had served multiple combat tours in the Pacific aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hancock, dropping torpedoes on enemy ships while dodging anti-aircraft fire. He knew the Avenger inside and out. He had recently transferred to Fort Lauderdale from Naval Air Station Miami, where he had served as a torpedo bombing instructor. On paper, Taylor was exactly the kind of leader you wanted guiding a training flight. The 4 student pilots flying with him that day were no amateurs either. Marine Captain Edward Joseph Powers had 300 total flight hours and 60 hours specifically in Avengers. Marine Captain George William Stivers carried similar credentials. Marine Second Lieutenant Forrest James Gerber and Navy Ensign Joseph Tipton Bossy rounded out the group. These men knew how to fly. They had studied the local waters extensively during previous training missions. They had maps, they had radios, and they had fuel for roughly 4.5 hours of flight time. Everything pointed toward a smooth afternoon exercise. The scheduled takeoff time was 13:45. But Taylor arrived late, and the 5 bombers did not lift off from the runway until 14:10. During pre-flight checks, the ground crews noticed something unusual. Every single aircraft was missing its clock. Navigation problem. Number 1 relied heavily on dead reckoning, the art of calculating your position based on your speed, heading, and elapsed time. Without clocks, the pilots would need to rely on their personal wristwatches. It was not considered a serious concern. Every man owned a watch. The oversight was noted and dismissed. The Avengers climbed into the afternoon sky, their engines humming in unison as they headed east over the shimmering Atlantic. The first leg of the exercise went smoothly. The bombers reached Hens and Chicken Shoals without incident and began their practice runs. At approximately 1500 hours, one of the pilots radioed the base requesting permission to drop his last bomb. The transmission was routine, almost mundane. There was no hint that anything was wrong. 40 minutes later, Lieutenant Robert Cox was forming up with his own group of student pilots at Fort Lauderdale, preparing for the same navigation exercise. His radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. It was not directed at him, but he could hear it clearly. A confused voice asking someone named Powers for a compass reading. Then Powers responded, "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." Cox recognized the symptoms of disorientation. He keyed his radio and transmitted, "This is FT-74. Plane or boat calling Powers, please identify yourself so someone can help you." After a few moments of silence, a man identified himself as FT-28. That was Taylor's call sign. Cox asked him what his trouble was. The response sent a chill through the control tower. "Both of my compasses are out," Taylor said, "and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get back." The Keys, the Florida Keys, a chain of islands stretching southwest from the Florida mainland. If Taylor was truly over the Keys, then he was far south of where he should have been. The training exercise had taken him east and north, not south. Something was terribly wrong. Cox immediately alerted base operations. A flight was in trouble. They were lost, and their leader claimed both his compasses had failed. The control tower personnel tried to remain calm. Getting lost was not unprecedented. Pilots became disoriented all the time, and the standard procedure was simple. Put the sun on your port wing and fly north until you hit the Florida coastline. From there, you could find your bearings and navigate home. Cox relayed these instructions to Taylor. The sun was to the west, descending toward the horizon. If Taylor flew north with the sun on his left side, he would inevitably reach land. But Taylor was not convinced he knew which way north actually was. His compasses were spinning uselessly. The islands below him looked wrong. "Broken," he kept saying. The land was broken. At some point in the confusion, Taylor made a fateful decision. He did not trust his instruments. He believed he was over the Gulf of Mexico, west of Florida. And if that was true, then flying northeast, not west, would bring him home. He ordered his flight to follow him on a heading of 030 degrees northeast. In the control tower, operators struggled to make sense of the fragmentary transmissions. They asked Taylor if his aircraft was equipped with a standard YG transmitter, an early form of IFF technology that could be used to triangulate the flight's position. The message was not acknowledged. They asked him to switch to the search and rescue frequency, 3,000 kilohertz, which would allow for clearer communication and easier tracking. Taylor refused. "I cannot switch frequencies," he said. "I must keep my planes intact." The logic was understandable. Taylor feared that if he changed radio frequencies, he might lose contact with his students. They were already confused and frightened. Staying on the same frequency was the only way to ensure they stayed together as a unit. But it also meant that the tower could barely hear them through the interference from Cuban radio stations and atmospheric static. Every transmission became a battle against noise. At 1656, the tower again urged Taylor to activate his YG transmitter. He did not acknowledge the request. Instead, his voice came through with a new order for his flight. "Change course to 090 degrees for 10 minutes. Due east, deeper into the Atlantic." Someone else in the flight, a voice that was never identified, cut in with raw frustration. "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we would get home. Head west, damn it." That outburst revealed a crucial truth. At least one of the student pilots knew that flying west was the correct answer. The Florida Peninsula lay to the west of them. If they had simply turned their aircraft around and flown into the setting sun, they would have reached land. But military discipline held them in formation. Taylor was the flight leader. He outranked them all. When he said fly northeast, they flew northeast. When he said fly east, they flew east. Even as their fuel gauges dropped lower and lower, they followed his lead. The weather was deteriorating. The scattered showers that had been forecast earlier were now developing into something more serious. Visibility was dropping. The sea below grew rougher. And the sun was sinking toward the horizon, taking with it the last visual reference points the pilots could use to orient themselves. By 1724, Taylor radioed for a weather check. The tower responded, but it is unclear whether he received the information. Communication was becoming increasingly sporadic. At approximately 1750, radio direction finder stations along the coast finally managed to triangulate Flight 19's position. The readings placed the aircraft within a 100 nautical mile radius of coordinates 29 degrees north, 79 degrees west. That put them far out in the Atlantic, north of the Bahamas, and well off the coast of central Florida. They were nowhere near the Keys or the Gulf of Mexico. Taylor's mental map was completely wrong. At 1804, Taylor transmitted a message that showed he was beginning to doubt his own judgment. Holding 270, we didn't fly far enough east. We may as well just turn around and fly east again. But flying east meant flying even farther from land. The sun had set. The sky was darkening. Fuel was running critically low. Somewhere out over that black water, 14 men in 5 bombers were circling in confusion, burning through the last of their gasoline. Taylor's final confirmed transmission came at approximately 1820. His voice was tense but controlled as he addressed his flight. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. 10 gallons. In an Avenger, that was roughly 15 minutes of flight time. The planes closed formation, their wingtip lights blinking in the gathering darkness. And then silence fell. Before we continue with the desperate rescue attempt that followed, if you're finding this story as gripping as I am, take a second to give this video a thumbs up. It helps the algorithm show this content to more history enthusiasts like yourself. Now, back to the Atlantic. As soon as it became clear that Flight 19 was in serious trouble, Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale began alerting every available resource. Merchant ships were notified to keep watch for distress signals or downed aircraft. Coast Guard cutters prepared to deploy. And at Naval Air Station Banana River, located just north of Fort Lauderdale on Florida's east coast, 2 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats were diverted from their scheduled training flights to conduct search and rescue operations. The PBM Mariner was a massive aircraft, specifically designed for long-range patrol and rescue missions. With a wingspan of over 118 feet and a fuel capacity of nearly 10 tons of aviation gasoline, it could stay aloft for hours while scanning vast stretches of ocean. The plane carried sophisticated radio equipment and could land on water to pick up survivors. It was exactly the kind of aircraft you wanted searching for downed airmen. Training 49, the designation for one of the rescue flights, departed Banana River at 19:27 hours. The aircraft, Bureau number 59225, carried a crew of 13 men under the command of Lieutenant Junior Grade Walter G. Jeffrey. They headed east toward the last known estimated position of Flight 19, their eyes scanning the dark waters below for any sign of wreckage or life rafts. At 19:30, 3 minutes after takeoff, the Mariner transmitted a routine radio check. Everything was normal. The crew was settling into their search pattern, methodically covering the assigned grid. That brief transmission was the last anyone ever heard from them. Around 21:15 hours, The crew of the SS Gaines Mills, an oil tanker operating off the Florida coast, witnessed something terrifying. A massive explosion in the night sky, flames leaping 100 feet into the air, burning for approximately 10 minutes before finally dying out. The tanker altered course toward the location and began searching the waters. They found only an oil slick and the unmistakable smell of aviation gasoline. There were no survivors, no bodies, just spreading fuel on the surface of a Black Sea. The escort carrier USS Solomons, operating in the same area, reported losing radar contact with an aircraft at the exact time and location of the explosion. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. PBM mariners were known for their problematic fuel systems. The flexible fuel lines had a tendency to work loose in rough weather, allowing gasoline vapors to accumulate inside the fuselage. A single spark from a radio transmitter or electrical system could ignite those vapors with catastrophic results. In the span of a few hours, the Navy had gone from responding to one emergency to confronting a disaster of unprecedented scope. 6 aircraft were now missing. 27 men had vanished. And the night was young, offering no hope of an effective search until dawn. The commanders at Fort Lauderdale and Banana River must have spent those dark hours in agonized anticipation, hoping against hope that the morning would bring good news. At daybreak on December 6th, the Navy launched the largest search and rescue operation in its history up to that point. Aircraft took off from bases up and down the Florida coast. Ships fanned out across the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Coast Guard vessels, merchant ships, and even private boats joined the effort. Over the next 5 days, search teams would comb more than 250,000 square miles of ocean and coastline. They found nothing, not a life raft, not a piece of wreckage, not a body, not even a floating seat cushion. The Atlantic had swallowed Flight 19 and the rescue mariner without leaving a single trace. It was as if 27 men and 6 aircraft had simply ceased to exist. The Navy convened a formal board of investigation to determine what had happened. The proceedings lasted several months and produced a report exceeding 500 pages. Investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed radio transcripts, reviewed weather data, and reconstructed the flight paths of all aircraft involved. Their conclusions were careful, methodical, and ultimately unsatisfying. The board determined that Lieutenant Taylor had become disoriented shortly after completing the bombing practice runs at Hens and Chicken Shoals. When he looked down at the islands below him, he somehow convinced himself that he was over the Florida Keys rather than the Bahamas. This single miscalculation cascaded into every subsequent decision he made. If he was over the Keys, then the mainland was to his northeast. If he was over the Gulf of Mexico, then flying west would take him deeper into open water rather than toward land. The investigators pieced together a probable sequence of events. After completing the bombing runs, Taylor likely overshot Gorda Cay, a small island in the Bahamas, and found himself over unfamiliar terrain in the southern Abaco Islands. When he continued northwest as planned, expecting to see Grand Bahama Island ahead of him, he instead saw Abaco Island off to his right. Believing his compass was malfunctioning, and that the island to his right must be Grand Bahama, he adjusted his course to what he thought was southwest, toward Fort Lauderdale. In reality, this new heading took him northwest, nearly parallel to Florida, and out over open ocean. The confusion deepened when Taylor encountered a series of small islands north of Abaco that bore a superficial resemblance to the Florida Keys. Now he was convinced he was in the wrong place entirely, unable to trust his instruments and receiving conflicting advice from the control tower. When the tower told him to fly west, he tried, but because his mental map was rotated by roughly 90 degrees, his version of west was actually northwest. He was flying farther from land with every passing minute. The board also noted several factors that compounded the disaster. Taylor refused to switch to the search and rescue radio frequency, making it difficult for ground stations to track his position. The atmospheric conditions that evening caused significant interference on the training frequency, further degrading communications. And by the time Taylor finally attempted to fly west in earnest, the sun had set, depriving him of his last reliable navigation reference. The report stated that Taylor was not officially at fault because his compasses had malfunctioned. Equipment failure was not something a pilot could control, but between the lines it was clear that the investigators believed Taylor's confusion had transformed a manageable problem into a catastrophe. If he had simply trusted his students, some of whom appeared to know they should fly west, the outcome might have been very different. Taylor's mother was devastated by the implications of the report. Her son, a decorated combat veteran, was being blamed for the deaths of 13 other aviators. She lobbied the Navy aggressively, arguing that without bodies or wreckage, there was no concrete evidence to support the board's conclusions. Eventually, the Navy relented. The report was amended to read, "Cause unknown," officially absolving Taylor of responsibility. But the mystery remained. Where had Flight 19 gone? The Atlantic Ocean is vast, but it is not infinite. Aircraft do not simply disappear. When planes crash into water, they leave debris. Life jackets float, oil slicks form, bodies surface. The complete absence of any physical evidence was almost as disturbing as the loss itself. The TBM Avenger was not an ideal aircraft for water landings. Its forward-mounted engine and heavy construction meant that it tended to nosedive upon impact, often trapping the crew inside before they could escape. Even if the pilots of Flight 19 had managed to ditch successfully, they would have faced long odds in the open ocean at night, without rescue ships nearby and with a storm system moving through the area. Survival time in the Atlantic in December, even in relatively warm Florida waters, was measured in hours rather than days. The loss of the PBM Mariner was easier to explain, though no less tragic. The explosion witnessed by the SS Gaines Mills matched the profile of a fuel vapor detonation, a known risk with that particular aircraft type. The 13 men aboard Training 49 probably never knew what hit them. One moment they were flying a search pattern, the next they were consumed by a fireball over the dark Atlantic. In the decades that followed, the disappearance of Flight 19 took on a life of its own. It became the founding legend of what would later be called the Bermuda Triangle, a loosely defined region of the Atlantic where ships and aircraft were said to vanish under mysterious circumstances. Writers and filmmakers seized upon the story, embellishing it with tales of magnetic anomalies, time warps, and extraterrestrial intervention. The 1977 science fiction film Close Encounters of the Third Kind opened with a dramatic depiction of the missing Avengers discovered in pristine condition in the Sonoran Desert, thousands of miles from where they disappeared. The implication was that aliens had abducted the aircraft and their crews. It was nonsense, of course, but it demonstrated how deeply Flight 19 had embedded itself in popular culture. The truth was more mundane, though no less haunting. A decorated pilot became disoriented. His compasses failed. He made a series of wrong decisions under pressure. His students followed him because that was what they had been trained to do. And when the fuel ran out, 5 torpedo bombers went down in rough seas at night with no hope of rescue. There was no mystery in that narrative, only tragedy. But the absence of wreckage continued to tantalize searchers. In 1986, during the search for debris from the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, salvage teams discovered an Avenger on the ocean floor off the Florida coast. Aviation archaeologist John Meyer raised the wreck in 1990 and initially believed it might be one of the missing planes from Flight 19. Detailed examination of the aircraft's bureau number proved otherwise. It was a different Avenger from a different era. In 1991, a treasure hunting expedition led by Graham Hawkes announced an even more exciting discovery. the wreckage of 5 Avengers clustered together on the seabed. This appeared to be exactly what searchers had been looking for, a group of aircraft that had gone down together as Flight 19 surely had. But when investigators examined the tail numbers, the truth emerged. These were not the planes of Flight 19. They were training losses from other accidents, aircraft that had crashed separately over the years and happened to come to rest in the same general area. Hawks returned to the site with new submersibles in 2004. He was able to identify one of the aircraft by its clearly readable bureau number, 23990. Records showed this plane had been lost at sea on October 9, 1943, more than 2 years before Flight 19 departed Fort Lauderdale. Its crew had survived. The other 4 aircraft in the cluster could not be definitively identified, but there was no evidence they belonged to Flight 19. The searches continued into the 2000s, expanding farther east into the open Atlantic. Modern sonar technology could map the ocean floor in unprecedented detail. Side-scan surveys revealed hundreds of shipwrecks and aircraft scattered across the seabed, but none of them matched the profile of Flight 19. The 5 Avengers remained missing, along with the PBM Mariner that had gone looking for them. In 2015, a newspaper report surfaced claiming that a wrecked World War II era plane with Navy markings had been recovered from woods near Sebastian, Florida, sometime in the mid-1960s. According to the story, the Navy initially identified the aircraft as being from Flight 19 before later retracting the statement. The report claimed 2 bodies were still inside the wreck when it was found. Despite Freedom of Information Act requests, the names of the occupants have never been released because the Navy maintains it does not have enough information to identify them. Other discoveries have proven to be dead ends. A TBM Avenger found in the Florida Everglades generated excitement until records revealed it had crashed on March 16, 1947, more than a year after Flight 19 disappeared. The pilot, Ensign Ralph Wachab, had developed vertigo and lost control. He was eliminated in the crash. The aircraft had nothing to do with the missing flight. As of today, no confirmed trace of Flight 19 or the Rescue Mariner has ever been found. The most likely explanation remains the one the Navy investigators reluctantly accepted decades ago. The Avengers ran out of fuel and ditched somewhere in the open Atlantic, far from land and any hope of rescue. The heavy aircraft sank quickly. The crews, if any, survived the impact, succumbed to exposure in the dark waters. The Mariner suffered a catastrophic fuel explosion and went down in flames. The mystery is not really a mystery at all. It is a tragedy compounded by bad luck, equipment failure, and human error. Lieutenant Taylor was a good pilot who made a terrible mistake under pressure. His students were disciplined young men who trusted their leader even when he was wrong. The rescue crews who went after them died because the aircraft they flew had a dangerous design flaw. There is nothing supernatural about any of it, but there is something profoundly unsettling about the complete absence of physical evidence. We live in a world where we expect closure. We expect to find the black box, recover the wreckage, identify the remains. When those things do not happen, our minds fill the void with speculation. That is how the Bermuda Triangle was born, not from any genuine supernatural phenomenon, but from our inability to accept that sometimes the ocean keeps its secrets forever. The 14 men of Flight 19 were officially listed as missing in action. Their names are inscribed on monuments and memorials across the country. George Devlin, Walter Parpart, Howell Thompson, George Pionessa, Herman Thielander, Bert Baluch, Robert Grubel, Robert Gallivan, William Lightfoot, Edward Powers, George Stivers, Forrest Gerber, Joseph Bossy, and Charles Taylor, the flight leader who got them lost and could not find the way home. The 13 men of training, 49 are remembered as well. Walter Jeffrey, Harry Cohn, Roger Allen, Lloyd Eliason, Charles Arsenault, Robert Cameron, Wiley Cargill, James Jordan, John Menendez, Philip Neiman, James Osterheld, Donald Peterson, Alfred Zwicky. They died trying to save their fellow aviators consumed by a fireball in the night sky. There is one small footnote to the story that offers a glimmer of what might have been. On the morning of December 5th, one of the crew members assigned to Flight 19 requested permission to sit out the exercise. Corporal Alan Cosner asked to be excused from the flight. His request was granted. He watched from the ground as the 5 Avengers taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky. He was the only man assigned to that mission who survived the day. Why did Cosner ask to be excused? The historical record does not say. Perhaps he was ill. Perhaps he had a personal matter to attend to. Perhaps he simply had a bad feeling about the flight and decided to trust his instincts. Whatever the reason, that single decision saved his life while his comrades vanished into the Atlantic. The story of Flight 19 has been told countless times over the past 8 decades. It has inspired books, documentaries, feature films, and endless speculation. It has become shorthand for the unexplained, a touchstone for anyone who wants to believe that there are forces in our world beyond human understanding. But strip away the mythology, and what remains is something far simpler and far more poignant. 27 men who did not come home. They were not abducted by aliens. They did not slip through a portal into another dimension. They did not find Atlantis or enter a time warp or fall victim to magnetic anomalies. They were aviators, young and old, experienced and novice, doing their jobs on an ordinary December afternoon. They got lost. They ran out of fuel. They went down in the ocean. And the ocean, which has claimed sailors since the first humans dared to venture onto its surface, kept them. The Navy never stopped searching for answers. Deep-sea expeditions continue to this day, using increasingly sophisticated technology to probe the depths where the Avengers might have come to rest. Perhaps someday a remotely operated vehicle will glide over a cluster of aircraft skeletons and confirm what everyone already knows. Perhaps the men of Flight 19 will finally be brought home, 8 decades after they took their last flight. Until then, they remain out there somewhere, suspended between history and legend. The Lost Patrol, the Vanished Flight, the men who flew into the twilight and never came back. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone who appreciates military history. Every subscription helps us continue uncovering the forgotten chapters of our past. The men of Flight 19 may be gone, but as long as we remember them, their story lives on. On that December day in 1945, the Atlantic Ocean claimed 27 souls. The sea never gave them back. And the questions we ask about their fate say more about us, about our need for answers, our fear of the unknown, than they do about the reality of what happened out there in the gathering dark.